Okay, welcome back. So we are on Unit 3, and the art medium that we're going to talk about for Unit 3 is sculpture, which makes sense because we just finished talking about classical Greece, and obviously we looked at a lot of Greek sculpture while we were doing that. Um, if you remember our first art medium that we discussed, and also if you remember, I prefer the term discipline or tradition over medium, but we'll use medium because everyone knows what we mean. The first medium that we talked about was drawing, and the second one was ceramics. And sculpture and ceramics and drawing are all three some of the oldest of art mediums. Sculpture is nearly as old as drawing is. And so in this lecture, we're going to cover sculpture in a couple of ways. One of the ways we're going to talk about is just the three main ways that sculpture is created. And then we're also going to talk about the difference between relief sculpture and freestanding and how that helps us to understand the fundamental idea of sculpture. And then we're also going to look at some contemporary examples of sculpture. So, and in the meantime, as we do this, we're going to get just a survey of a whole bunch of sculpture from around the world from various times. So, as I was saying, sculpture can be made in three main ways. Those are additive, reductive, and indirect, right? Additive is primarily where you're either doing assemblage or constructive type work, where you're putting pieces together, or modeling. This also counts as additive, so molding clay counts as additive. Reductive is primarily carving, and indirect sculpture is primarily casting. Okay, so in terms of constructive and additive sculpture, right, and constructive and modeling type sculpture, we see ceramic pieces, we see assemblages using wood, metal pieces where they have been welded together, like this David Smith piece right there. It's beautiful, and so any kind of way of making a work of sculpture where you're connecting parts and pieces together is additive. Reductive sculpture is primarily carving, primarily stone carving, but also some examples of wood carving. Of course, from the ancient world and the classical world, almost entirely the only thing that survives is the stone carvings, right? We're pretty confident that these people probably made a lot of wood carving, but we just don't see that as much because the wood doesn't last as long. And various kinds of stone can be carved. And of course, there are other materials that can be carved as well. A standard material for beginning design students to use in like a 3D design class would be to do a carving using cast plaster. You cast the plaster into a block and then you carve it. Also, sometimes people will do carvings using styrofoam. All right, and then the other major form of a way of making sculpture is called indirect sculpture, and that, like I said, is almost entirely casting, and casting is almost entirely metal casting, like bronze casting. But there are some exceptions to that. There are some artists who cast with other materials, such as resins and plastics, casting with ceramics and plasters. Um, but we're primarily going to be looking at metal casting and primarily looking at bronze casting. Now, if we were taking this class in person, we would have a chance to visit the metal studio in the art building, and Professor Gibson would give us a demo on doing a lost wax form of casting for small pieces using silver, and it uses a centrifuge instead of gravity to pull the silver through the mold, and it's really fun and exciting. There's always this sense that we're living on the edge when we're pouring molten silver. So to make a bronze cast, right, there's a number of steps. The most important thing to remember are, let's see, number one, remember that you have to make, in almost any kind of lost wax process, you have to make a model first. You have to make a thing, like a version of the actual sculpture that you're planning on making. Normally, when you make that thing, and you make it out of impermanent materials because it's probably going to get destroyed in the process of then making the molds and then finally making the finished pieces. But sometimes there are ways of making a original model that then can last. There are ways of doing it where you could then later make it out of clay and then later fire that mold, so you have that as a permanent piece. But generally, that piece is lost. Okay, so then once you've made your model, you then have to make a mold from the model. And usually, like for large sculptures, complicated sculptures, like this figurative piece we're talking about here, you'd have to do those molds in parts in order to ensure that the final, when the bronze goes through it, that it will pour through cleanly. You have to assemble those parts together, or do them in parts. And then once you've made a mold of both the the outside and the interior, right? And you've made a mold for both the outside as well as the interior, and so you have a gap in between, and then you fill that gap with wax, right? You pour the hollow wax into the in-between space, and that holds it all together, and then you pour the bronze, and the bronze, because it's molten hot, it's going to melt the wax is going to pour out, and the bronze is going to fill in all the spaces where the wax used to be, and that's going to, yeah, it's going to make the bronze sculpture. Now, one thing that is a little bit different sometimes is you can have a system where the wax is originally, like the model itself, the first model that you make is made out of wax, or you can make a piece where the top layer surface of the model is made out of wax, and then you make a cast, and then when you pour it, the bronze actually removes that wax that was part of the model, so it literally destroys your model. And those kind of systems of lost wax process, obviously, therefore, you can't make multiple copies. But many types of bronze casting you can make them in a series. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, so first thing we talked about was 3 different ways that sculptures can be made, right? Additive, subtractive, and indirect. Now I want to talk about sculpture in terms of the main difference between relief versus freestanding, or in other words, how much space does a work of sculpture use? Sculptures can be really, really flat, and when they're very, very flat, we call them relief, and we call them low relief. Probably the most classic example of really, really very fine detail, but very low relief is the Palette of Namur. And no part of that carving really is raised much more than like a quarter of an inch. Or it can be deeper, like when we're looking at the Victory Stele of Naram Sin, right? It's carved much more deep, right? Maybe 3, 4, maybe 6 inches in places. This is a pretty big piece. And in some parts, it's even not only carved deep in, but it's carved around. So you can see a little bit of the back of figures, a little bit of the backs of the arms. But high relief is extremely removed from the surface. So here's a contrast between low relief and high relief, right? So the Dying Lioness is also a classic example of low relief, of bas relief, whereas the pediment figures of the Parthenon are a classic example of high relief. They are so high relief, in fact, that they were made as separate pieces and then assembled onto the pediment. They still count as being relief sculpture because they were designed with backs that were meant to attach to a backing wall. And so they're not meant to be seen in the round or freestanding. But as you can see here in the British Museum, that's exactly how we look at them. They have become freestanding sculptures because they've been removed from their context. Okay, we have about less than a minute to go, so we have just a little bit of time to talk about the difference between sunken relief and counter relief. These are 2 kind of odd sub categories of low relief. So counter relief is basically a mirror image release that can be used for stamping. So like with this signet ring right here, where you can press something in and then you can make a positive version of that same thing. Sunken relief is a little bit different. Sunken relief looks like that, but it's not actually the same because the artist carves deeply into the edge of every form, but then rounds it out positively towards us. But it's a way of avoiding having to carve all the negative space. And it's one of the interesting things Well, I'll get to that at the next lecture. I'll see you.